Pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit of the balance of being pragmatic and idealistic. And maybe a good just position to your talk, Taylor, in terms of hoping the world evolves in a direction and maybe prompting it to evolve in that direction. John Zannos, for those of you who I haven't met. I'm with Inflection, early stage venture fund, early investor in Molecule, big supporter of DeSci in general, and by definition, personally, a big advocate of this. Because by training, a scientist, actually got my graduate degree in this very building a little while ago, and realized that the business of improving science is the business of the world, right? This is fundamentally how we make the world a better place. And my personal background beyond being a scientist, long-term technologist, in business, investor, founder, but more importantly, long-term open source bigot. Very early in the Linux Foundation, part of a number of boards that help make open source exist. And the point is well taken. These models exist out there, but they're not applied, and they're imperfect. And to be honest, there's a lot of work that's been done that's been never compensated. And the way the models evolved is a handful of big corporations were the benefactors of open source. And a number of bigger corporations, Amazon comes to mind, were the consumers of open source and returned very little to those initial creators. So the reason it's not broadly adopted, because it's by far an imperfect system. But on the plus side, it's a pretty darn good system in supporting innovation, which has brought us to this stage. This stage being where we are with Web3, this stage where we are talking even about these concepts. So I hope you bear with me. I'll try to share a little bit of perspective, and certainly a perspective that's driven by how do we invest in this space, propagate it, allow it to grow, and I thought there was a great discussion going on, and how do we make the ultimate yardstick be adoption, because that is the yardstick that matters. So I'm just going to do, not sure why this is working this way and not showing up. One of the problems is this is an incredibly complex system. We talk about publishing, we talk about scientific method, we talk about all these elements, and you know why it's been so long and painful to change? Because it's super complex, and by definition, any complex system has lots of inertia, as was pointed out, and most importantly, by the very method, the scientific method, right, it ultimately benefits by openness, and yet everything that we put in process around this method, the industry supporting science, the academic industry supporting science, even at an individual level, how we compensate ourselves or judge ourselves as scientists, fights against openness, right? I want to be the first inventor. I don't want my idea stolen. These are conflicts. They're just conflicts in the system that exists that we're trying to tear down, but they're big conflicts. I operate under this premise. We have innovated in the world over the history of mankind astronomically. So the system isn't broken. It's just not particularly good, right? And the biggest problem I feel is that science, by definition, the system should be great. So every day that's what we strive for, right? We're trying to make the system better. Not perfect, because if we could do that, we would do it, right? It's a broken system that produces great results. It can be better. We should put those incentives in place to foster transparency, collaboration, all the things we were talking about, but those systems aren't perfect by any stretch. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about how do you break inertia in something like this that we're trying to solve. And this is code for how do you get funded, how do you get momentum, how do you drive adoption. I think the biggest challenge is always, what are the right leverage points, right? What are we trying to break and why does that matter? And how do good examples get multiplied? And are good examples in one country or one segment actually scalable in other countries? We should always learn, but they're not always transferable. The other thing is, how do we create activation energy to break through this inertia? Because if we don't do that, what we do is understand the problem, but never change it or never solve it. So a quick synopsis from our perspective and my perspective, because we've been tracking this since its formation, is this idea of certainly data and tools are fundamental to the scientific process. Anything we can do to open them, distribute data more effectively, and to remove the barriers is going to be super imperative. As we talked a little bit about, open source software, open source data is imperative. But I think the biggest unknown at this moment is, how do we balance this kind of rapid evolutions that's happening around machine learning and AI, where basically we are creating models that are dependent on data, and we haven't quite even figured out how do we distribute data fairly and openly. And when data becomes the IP itself, we don't have systems in place at all to deal with that problem, at all. Publishing, I won't spend as much time as I was going to, because I agree with everything that's been said thus far. So broken models got to be fixed. Very interested in talking to anybody that thinks they're on the track to fixing that. Funding mechanisms. This is another part. I know IP in the traditional sense and upon itself isn't a great model. We've experimented with NFTs as a way to capitalize IP. I think all these models are still imperfect. But the bottom line is, ultimately, great idea has to have broad benefit in what's going on there. For all the good and bad of it, we still define benefit and measure it in terms of capital return, right? Ultimately, this long-term chain ultimately has to create capital that's returned to the inventors, returned to every middleman along the process. But if we don't solve that problem, we're not going to ultimately change how science is performed, how science is distributed, and ultimately how that benefit helps us all. So I think one of the main things here is, like, what are the policies that we're trying to modify, right? What are the governance models we're trying to change? How are we going to change data sharing, as we talked a little bit about? And how do we protect rights, right? Everything from, that's my data about my blood type, which may be a unique single blood type in all the world that solves problems that we don't have solutions for now. Like, there's a long chain from there to solution. How does everybody get credit? How do we protect the rights of everybody that move that forward? Because we know in the current system, those rights aren't protected, right? Somebody jumps in somewhere along, grabs some data, does something innovative, no responsibility to compensate backwards. No guarantee that they'll be compensated forward, right? This is a big, complex process of trust, and we're trying to solve that. And at the end of the day, somebody mentioned it, right? I think it was during the panel. As people, we're not going to do good things just because they're good. Many great ideas never get implemented. So I believe, in general, minimal effort, maximum gain is what drives adoption. So I would ask everybody in this room, as you ask yourselves, is this solution set I'm attacking or advocating or looking for funding or spending my nights and days solving, have I solved a big, big problem with minimal effort? If it's a huge problem, takes a lot of effort, it may never be implemented. If it's real easy, but nobody cares, it'll never be implemented. So try to strike the right balance. So, activation energy. Everybody in this room, I think we have great minds working hard problems. There is capital available to solve it. But I think too often we're not using the right yardstick, talking about how we all think about what we're doing will actually be adopted. And how will it be adopted in the reasonable short term as compared to in the undefined future. So the reality check of what we do is we're trying to track, like, is there real momentum? Is there real adoption? So on the plus side, large number of projects in the DeSci space, fair amount of money, a good number of users, a good cross-section of sources. Some of you guys are in the room. Hey, yeah. We'll give an attaboy where an attaboy's due. The reality is we're at the beginning. We all know we're at the beginning. So are we seeing a little bit of traction? Great. We should be happy. On the downside, have we really produced any research outputs? Have we produced any real large-scale research being funded at the scale? And we know by these numbers, we're at the very, 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 very beginning, right? Because we know how many hundreds of billions of dollars are put in the research world, right? This is background noise numbers. This is not even background noise. And then the other yardstick, are we creating mechanisms to protect IP? That's different. And I'm happy to be told by anybody where these numbers are wrong. James, if there's more recent data, I could use it. But the reality is we all need to recognize we are at the very beginning of this journey. So how do we improve? I think there's a couple things. We don't improve what we don't measure. We don't improve what we don't understand are the inputs and outputs we're trying to track. And we don't improve what we don't with a little bit of conversation of standards, right? We don't improve what doesn't become standard. Because to be honest, if it doesn't become standard, nobody cares. So, a couple ideas. First and foremost, we got to start measuring fundamentals. We recently did a self-evaluation about being excited about the last 2 years before the down. And like many people, on the crypto excitement bus. And the reality is we tracked stuff that didn't matter. We tracked simple things that nobody cared about. How many followers? Look how much activity in discourse. I got lots and lots of token holders. These things, unfortunately, were not the right metrics. Understanding what problem we're really solving, why it really matters to society, how are we tracking usage, real usage, how are we creating real value, how are we creating real revenue or capital return in this economy that we all live in. So, number one, let's measure things that matter. Number two, let's think about the long term. By definition, we're all in science. We only care about the long term. So let's design ourselves for long term. Not tokens, not governance models. Are we really building? I 100% agree with your comment. We need to be building bridges between the existing institutions and the new ones we're advocating. If we're not doing that, we will never change science. Another thing is we really need to ask ourselves, who are our customers? This is my question about, is the customer the journal or is the customer the scientist? The real answer is both. It's the existing institution and the new institution, right? So we need to be disciplined on tracking that. Don't buy the hype, right? We can't buy our own hype. The thing about how we're governing these things are super interesting. They're problems that they're being solved, but in reality, nobody cares, right? Nobody cares. I thought the example was very on. Microsoft works. We're not trying to design better corporations or better scientific institutions. What we're trying to do is improve them. We're trying to make scientists that are in corners of the world that can't get research money or can't be seen or can't be heard, right? We're not trying to make MIT better. You know what? MIT's pretty damn good. Let's help the rest of the world that's not so good. So deep problems, scientific collaboration. Let's not try to do things separately. Let's go back to institutions like this and talk to people that are successful and help them be more successful. And I would ask us all to try to be much more simpler in our thought process. We add a lot of complexity. We love our mechanisms. We love our governance models. But if we can't explain them to our grandmother, we're probably on the wrong track. Like, let's try to keep it a little simple. So I'm happy to talk to anybody about this. I don't think all my data is right. and I certainly have lots of biases, but I will tell you, I personally am deeply committed to making science work better. And I think DeSci is the first thing in maybe 2,000 years that's trying to do that. So all in on trying to participate and collaborate. But I'm not going to be idealistic, right? We're trying to make something that works pretty darn good a whole lot better. All in on that. And the yardstick has to be adoption. If we're doing things and we're talking to ourselves and exciting ourselves about our own speculation, we're on the wrong track. And if there's anything in the world that matters more, it's the scientific endeavor, right? We touch everything that touches every human, everything in the world, every plant, animal, and scarily, everything outside the world, right? We have a pretty damn big footprint, so we should be smart. And happy to talk, debate, argue, experiment, and of course, part of the reason I'm here is happy to fund. So appreciate your time, happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Do I have any time? I don't know.
I think you're the last one. I mean, you can go and then James might close this up.
Mine's short, so we have time.
Oh.
Okay. So, I can update some of your numbers.
Oh, good.
With one project that adds about 15 to 20,000 people. We created a COVID vaccine, small spike protein. A lot of very tangible things. And using your green check marks for the past 11 years is a very solid thing that you can't fund. But what you can do is fund the ecosystem around it. So so it runs on this distributed computing platform called Berkeley Open Infrastructure for Network Computing. It's been around for many, many, many years. And you can fund distributed computing projects at universities, give researchers money to do research, we give them computation. Is that something that you think would help transition researchers and institutions to a DeSci model where it's not like you're funding the project, it's you're funding the scientist who is using a DeSci tool? And then a second question, I'm really interested in your thoughts on the future of IP.
Yeah, so I'll try to answer the first and the second, and happy to continue this discussion because this is really centered to the. We spend a lot of time scouring the data to find a kind of collective view of the best status of the project. So I'm thrilled to hear more progress than we've communicated. And the common problem we all should solve is then why is this information tucked in corners is our problem, right? Somehow we need to collaborate to put it all front and center. I think there is an opportunity for funding the ecosystem that supports the scientists and the researchers and therefore drive adoption. I think one of the problems always in the way we've structured the capital markets that support innovation is that we need to invest in companies that become entities that create return. I'm very interested, is there a model that can be more efficient in supporting scientists as individuals, but we have to solve the return question, right? In other words, I can't fill the void of a nonprofit research investor, right? Because I have investors that are looking for a return, and if I just do research investing, I'm not necessarily always in line. This is the problem of the value system not being seamless. So that's a long way of saying it depends. It depends on if the research can ultimately be mapped to an entity that ultimately can become successful, then all sorts of new capital markets open up. In terms of the existing ecosystems that are more researchy that can be supported, there are mechanisms for doing that, as you know. But I do think it's I think you said it earlier, right? Building the bridge between the open source history and the new Web3 DeSci model is a real important bridge that somehow we ought to do a better job. And I'm not sure what those mechanisms are. Second question, IP. I think right now we're at an intersection where IP is fundamentally broken. We are at a moment where data will become the IP because the models will manipulate it, and we don't really have a great way to monetize data in the simplest terms. So open to any discussion with anybody that has ideas around SAC.
So I want to take an issue with your statement that you have to be able to explain anything you do to your grandmother. I have a pretty smart grandmother who produced more things than any other living human on earth. And I could never explain to her anything I've ever done in my entire life. I also will argue that internet would never come to existence if we had to do only things that we can explain to our grandmothers.
Okay, I'll argue back. My point isn't that at the beginning of the journey you have to be able to explain it to your grandmother, right? My point is that at some point the internet became broadly adopted. And to get that adoption, people needed to do three things. Understand what it is, see the value, and then it had to scale. It had to scale. Technology.
Second and third, yes. The first one, no. I will again argue with you that most people do not understand what internet is. They use it, but they have no concept of clue. And I think the blockchain will reach massive adoption when people will be able to use it without knowing what it is and how you even use it.
I see your point. I won't disagree that people don't necessarily need to understand how electricity works to use electricity.
And they don't.
Right, but they do need to understand what electricity is, right? I
don't think, again, I will argue, and I've seen examples of it, that, graduate students at Harvard did not understand how electricity works or what it is.
Okay. All right, that is scary though, but.
They were English majors.
Oh, okay. Well, that's, go ahead, I'm sorry, question.
So kind of to both of these points here, you mentioned in particular about the governance. You mentioned that governance should be simple, and I think that a lot of the points about making it simple or explainable or whatever, as a beginning for this bridge between open research and traditional research and DeSci is a really essential step to get those people in. But for you and Inflection, I guess, as a thesis, what does the sort of 10-year vision look like with regards to the complexity of these systems? Because, for example, governance, if you want to participate now, single token voting is the easiest way to get involved. But you can imagine a system where if you call some of Jonathan's governance system, where you have splitting the reputation, stacking the reputation, multiple different parties involved. So what is sort of yourself and Inflection, the sort of 10-year view on how the complexity of the system?
Yeah. And we're debating this even amongst ourselves, because I think on one hand, we recognize that we absolutely have a need for simplification to drive adoption, right? And the worst near-term example is, our concern of the pullback of the progress we made in the crypto space and Web3. Too much complexity, broader economics and world politics, lots of things that happen. But we have to be honest, there's a pullback of adoption that's pretty recognized. So we want to balance simplicity in the near term, and for us the near term would be 5 years and less to drive adoption. We recognize there's great opportunities for more complex governance models that hopefully will do a better job of governing, to use that term. But yet I'm personally still a believer that we should be fighting very hard to preserve simplicity. And so when we add complexity in the governance models, as Jonathan outlined, they should have real material benefit. And if they don't have real material benefit, then I wouldn't add the complexity. If the benefit is inherently an inherent parameter in what you're trying to accomplish, then embrace that complexity, right? Hopefully that answers the question.
Earlier we heard about the hope for the brighter future not always being enough to push a system towards change. So when it comes to incumbents in the space, including pharma, for instance, what do you think are maybe some of the fear factors or risks that could push some of the incumbents towards change in either the near or midterm?
Irrelevance. Their biggest fear is their model changes around them to the point that they become the next Kodak, right? So on the plus side, that's the behavior of any long surviving corporation. So for any new entity, you should understand that and capitalize on it, either by fear or by demand. On the negative side, we know we have historical bad corporate actors. And what I mean by that, fighting innovation unfairly by squashing it, not competing against it. The little historical side note is where I think that's been the problem with open source, is we created open source software, which was a great mechanism for innovation by creating a simpler licensing structure. The downside was that there was no real great mechanism to fund people individually. So I think you mentioned it, some great innovation that most stuff in Linux depends on, was done by a handful of people that, didn't become super rich because they did it. And yet, a number of corporations recognized the value, became fundamentally members of the Linux Foundation and other ways to fund open source, or more importantly, more recently consume open source software without feeling a big obligation to return a lot back to the original creators. So I think that's the thing we got to manage against, right? So on the plus side, create fear will drive these companies to becoming part of this ultimately, right? They don't want to become irrelevant, and we all need to watch and make sure we're not taken advantage of unfairly, and that's a bit more concerning. But to be honest, that's part of the role of the capital markets, because we should help find great ideas and put capital behind them so they can't be squashed. Does that answer the question?
Last one. So yeah, kind of connected to the discussion about open source and funding, I'm interested in your thoughts on funding infrastructure. Like we talked earlier about archive, preprinted server, and like how the person who made it never got anything for that effort. Like where do you think infrastructure funding should come from?
I have a very strong opinion on this, and so I'll qualify it that it's both mine, but it's also, as a firm, we've come to this conclusion. We actually think the next 20 years, and I certainly believe this, that infrastructure will become really important. And historically, we lived with A16Zs, the software ate the world and everything's software, and software is great to fund because you don't need a lot of capital and you make a lot of profit. I think actually in the next 20 to 50 years, infrastructure will become much more important. Deep science will become much more important. We will start building things again. I think the intersection of AI and science, we're going to see rapid innovation. It'll become easy to make code. It'll be difficult to make rocket ships, right? So that's where we're going to see. And this is also why personally I am so excited about this discussion about DeSci, because ultimately we are going to create things, and that's going to be built on scientific innovation, and we need to do a better job of fostering that science.
So do you see the venture capital funding infrastructure?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry if I'm not being clear. Infrastructure is freaking important. We want to fund it.
Actually, last.
It's more of a comment. So what you're saying is we seek to do DeSci in the next few decades, not because it's easy, but because it's hot.
Yeah. I'll let you close on that note.